During the first hour, what we're going to do is we're basically just going to talk shader basics. And I guess the most obvious start would be to say that shaders are programs that help us visualize virtual objects. They are written in shading language and they operate in a different way than usual code. I think that we could very easily go to here, Shader Toy, and check on any of these shaders, and we can check the code of the shader. And if you have had experience with code, and you probably had experience with code, what you can see here is quite different. It's quite different than the...
I could have been so much different.
Hoi.
Oh, why doesn't my link work?
Your link is not working?
No, I actually remember.
I want to tap for the P, so tap for the P.
One tap, CSGO, 100% inches.
No.
One wall hack and
Oh, wait a minute.
one tap is the
What were you saying, Andres?
Okay, chill. Let's go back. Shader code is not as easy to read or not as intuitive as, for example, the ones we are more used to, like C#. We can still find in it things like vectors. We can still find in variables and things that will feel more or less approachable, but their structure is completely different. It's basically divided into I think it's a fragment shader and a vertex shader.
Yes.
I think that's it. And vertex shader operates basically on each of the vertices of the scene or of the object, and the fragment shader operates on each of the pixels of the image, or each of the fragments of the screen, which in a way it's talking about what a shader is doing. It's basically doing some operations with your mesh and then doing some operations with your screen. This is why when you have a vertex displacement shader, these wobbly shaders, this does not affect the collisions, for example, because this is only updated on the screen. Okay? We are not going to go deep into the coding of shaders. We are not going to do this. If you want to understand, I included this thing, the shader basics with Freya, and she talks about all of these things and all of the math that is behind it. But we are going to be dealing with shaders in a more visual way. We're going to be utilizing nodes in order to operate them. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to write down some things. Let's start with, so shaders are a piece of code that specifies how a mesh is going to be shaded. And this goes from the very, very basics, like plain colors and lit shader, just one color, to very complicated stuff, things that create displacement, things that create motion, things that are animated through time. We're going to be utilizing Blender because it's accessible, Unity because we all work with Unity, and Substance, which is one of the most utilized shader making suites around. And each of these programs have a very different language. They all utilize nodes, but once we try and do the very basic with the three of them, you will realize that you can utilize knowledge from one into the other. So I would say let's go into Blender. Let's go into Blender and let's just do let's go to the world origin. Let's create a cube. And if we have another tab that is not the 3D viewport, we can go onto the shader editor, which is down there. Shader editor is the 2D workspace where we're going to be able to utilize the nodes. So once we have our shader editor, we make sure that we're on the object level, because you can also specify, you can create shaders for the world, which is funny when you want to do, for example, volumetric stuff or something. You go into the world tab, but right now, and I think by default, we're going to be utilizing the object tab. The other thing we want to do is just press new. Whenever we have the object selected, we will have the opportunity to create a new material for it. And if we just press new, a new shader is created. And this is the basic principled shader of Blender, which, as you can see, it utilizes this small thing that Blender utilizes for all materials, which is the material output that contains one node for surface, another input for volume, and another input for displacement. And then it has the actual shader, which is this big chunk of different values and different inputs that we can utilize. Yeah?
Just to like divide up my Blender to get like that node system, because I have the shading tab, but just opening that one in the same.
Yes.
How?
Okay, the way we divide Blender tabs is in the corners. You see that whenever you go into a corner, you get this cursor. If you press and drag, you create a new one. And also you can go onto the lines that divide the different screens. Right click and say the area options. You can say vertical split or horizontal split. Sometimes you will get the option of joining areas, which is useful for.
Right now I just have two of the same, like the modeling space, to make that into the shader space, the node space.
Are you here?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay.
Well, I have two of those.
You have two of these, like this?
Yeah.
So what you want is to go into the top left corner, and here is where you can choose the shader editor.
Oh, okay. I see. Thank you.
Yes.
That's good. Great.
This workspace is fine. I think this is okay. If you have this bar here, you can press N to get rid of it.
Thanks. Så helt af venstre hjørne, hvor der er en cirkel over på sådan en mesh. Ja, så tror jeg, du shader ind. Så inden for det der boks. Yes. Yes.
You're there?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay, so the most basic thing we can do with nodes is change their internal parameters. Without any type of connection, we can just go here and change the base color, for example. This is something we can also do, I think, in shader graph, and we can also do definitely in Substance. Yeah.
This, it won't, well, it says I've changed the color, but it's still.
Yeah, that's because you're in solid mode. So if you go onto the material preview, if you press Z on your keyboard, you should be able to go into material preview.
Yeah, nothing really helps.
Okay, look here on the top, you have the different shading modes. If you go to material preview, you should be able to do that.
I can't really click on it, I don't know why.
Where was it?
Oh! It's just slow.
Okay. Damn, if this is slow. Houdini is definitely going to give us technical problems. But okay, it's fine. Blender should not be very slow with...
I just think I maybe spammed the button a bit.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. Let's create a basic object, let's create a basic material for it, let's play around a little bit with some of the material properties. Now, principled shader or principled BSDF, it's a PBR shader. PBR stands for physically based rendering. Thank you. And it's basically going to give us a lot of functionalities that are connected with how materials operate in the real world. Before having the principled shader, we would have a, I think it was called, it was, if we go to shaders, it was a diffuse shader, which basically just contains a color and roughness and an input for normal. This was the typical Blender shader. When you created a new one, when you created a new material, this would be what it gives you. And they created this principled shader that contains all of these other parameters. And that, if you think about it, looks slightly like the basic lit material from Unity, because it has an input for metallic, it has an input for specular, and it even has certain other inputs that Unity doesn't have, like subsurface radius, and then also normal stuff like normals and tangent and emission also there. Unity also has emission. So some of these we know, some of these are slightly more weird. But I invite you to start playing around with some of the values, like for example roughness very easily gives you this plasticky look. Metallic, also easy to change a lot how it looks. If you're having a cube, maybe you want to just to see better how these shaders change. You could add a small bevel modifier and just do some segments there so that you can see the edges easier. If you keep playing around, at some point you will break the material, or you will do weird things that Blender doesn't really understand. Like for example, a metallic with subsurface scattering is very weird. Blender can try and do it, but it doesn't have a very a physical, like natural reference. But it still doesn't matter. Do we all understand what these input values are? Like, do we understand what albedo means, roughness means, metallic, emission, alpha? Are these things known? Most of them.
Not all.
Which one troubles
The
you?
whole subsurface category.
Subsurface, that's amazing. Okay, let's look at that. Subsurface scattering is this beautiful thing that happens with light. This goes into the category of weird shit that light does when interacting with stuff in the world.
Skin, for example.
Yes, skin is one of those materials that are difficult to recreate because they have so many things going on. We're also so used to looking at skin and to know how skin works, then making a shader for skin so easily ends up looking plasticky or flat or wrong. Also, painting skin is very difficult, like getting right the different values of the face or how light lights up the face. In any case, usually when we have an object, let's say this is our object, and we have a light source, the most typical thing that is going to happen is that light hits our object, some light is absorbed, some light is reflected, which is the color that we see of the object. what happens with subsurface scattering and in general translucent, I think it's translucent materials, is that light actually goes in the surface. And what happens inside the surface of our skin with light is that lights keep bouncing, virtually lighting the inside of our skin. The most obvious example is when you put your hand before a lamp and you see the light through your fingers. In this case, some light even gets out of the skin, virtually making the skin emissive. So it changes the color of the skin, or the perceived color of the skin, because from the inside of the skin, we are having parts that are lit. So if our skin was red and it gets lit from the inside, we will get a pink tone from the inside. This is subsurface scattering. Scattering, you know what it means. Scatter is the diffusion of the light rays. Subsurface, it goes inside the surface. In computer graphics, we don't need to simulate deeper levels of the surface. And actually, if you get very close to an object, you see that you clip through it. There is no depth in the object. The object is not really solid. But if we go to something that could be understood as, let's do something that could be kind of human. I'm going to reduce the material, and I'm going to put the roughness up. And now I'm going to apply some subsurface. Now the tone of the saturation of the color automatically goes down. And depending on how big the subsurface value is, it loses more or less intensity. This is not very easy to see here because we don't have a lot of shapes to work with. But if you had a slightly more complicated one, like I'm just gonna make the monkey, because the monkey probably is gonna give us a nicer result, and I'm just going to subdivide it. And I'll give it the same material, which was this one, I think. And now I'm going to go into the rendered view. On material preview, you can definitely see it, but it's with the render view that we can more easily see what subsurface is doing. You see these. You see how at the start of shadows and at the end of shadows we have a certain saturation happening. By the way, the end of the sudden galaxy, it's I didn't know it was there. It's weirdly helping create the setup.
It looks already fleshy.
Yes, it feels.
Oh, that ear.
Yes. You see, it's definitely not perfect because this is Eevee. We are still working with a real-time renderer, so it's basic. If we went and changed the renderer to cycles, the subsurface scattering would actually be calculated way more precisely. Which means that if we had a light source, like let's do a point light, and let's put that point light behind the ear there, and you see how the ear gets lit. This is not that easy to get with Eevee. See? It doesn't care. Particularly with point lights, which are very complicated, much more complicated to work with in real time. This doesn't work. Cycles, though, that's the thing. That's the trick. Subsurface scattering is relatively new in video games. We usually just fake it in weird ways. and it's more of an expensive effect that you can have in films and you can have in renders, or you can have in animation, things that are pre-rendered. But we are having better and better real-time subsurface scattering, sometimes making very nice looking stuff. And to be honest, the EV version, even though it looks slightly plasticky, it does feel like there is some saturation inside of the surface. I don't know what happens if we keep doing this. You see that it gives this rubbery, translucent feeling.
What if you change the subsurface color to something like pink?
Yeah, the subsurface color is something that definitely helps. Like for example, an easy change would be to give the subsurface color something that is related with what is inside, like blood. So we give it a blood tone, and then even if we had a green, even if the skin was green, the skin of this monkey was green, we would have some red reflections inside. And we can combine this with other stuff. So if we created some roughness and some texture in it, it would be easy. But okay, this is all principled shader stuff, and it is very complex. Let's look at how the basic shader looks on. Do we still have the coconut open? I'll close this thing. Let's go into Substance. And let's see how the Substance basic setup looks like.
I failed to realize I only downloaded the launcher.
Okay, I mean it's completely fine. We're just gonna check the basic setup. What we can see in Substance Designer is we have a graph, which is the main window, which is basically going to be what we have here. It's going to be our shader editor. This is the graph. Then we have a 3D view, a 2D view of the textures we're going to generate, some parameters that are going to be linked to the node we are working with, and then some file explorer thing. And I think that in here we can create a new substance. Yes, with Control-N, or when you go to File, you can just create a new substance. And this is going to give you, like, basically which node or which setup are we going to start with. And they have a bunch of it. They have a PBR one, which would be the equivalent of the principled shader. Then we have several different ones. We have a standard one, and we have some other stuff. Alchemist filter. These are for working with Alchemist, which is the other program they have. So I'm just gonna choose the standard one to see how it is. I'm going to say okay. And here you can see a different way. Like the nodes, the master nodes are not compiled into one piece. They are different outputs that you can move around and do whatever you want. So you could virtually lose this thing around, which is kind of funny, but I don't know, it's the way they work with it, and these are the inputs for them. All of them are right now uniform colors, and the normal one is basically an empty normal. And we can double click in order to check what are they. And these are the, let's say, the master nodes that are going to create the material for us. So these ones we can delete. And if we created another, let's say, color.
Andres, can you slow down?
Yeah.
Yeah, then.
How did you create these nodes?
Yes, in order to create, we can either right click and say add node. We can press space.
But I think I want to use standard. You use the Adobe standard then?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. Like
add node, and then because there are like 20 different numbers.
It's the same that it's going to happen in Blender. We're going to have access to all of the nodes at the same time. We're not making something particular right now.
No, it's just when I open app node, there's bitmap, there's blend, there's blur, there's channels, all that.
All of these things, yeah?
Yeah. Which one do I choose?
Well, right now, what we were having before was, here you can see it, a uniform color.
Yeah, alright.
So that should be something that you should uniform.
Yeah,
Uniform color is something you can find.
yeah.
And maybe we could try and see what are the things that come with color.
Great.
What I'm going to recommend all the time here is that if you have a certain train of thought, like for example, I'm going to want to work with colors, you go onto the shader search bar and just type color. And then you can check the amount of stuff that the program is giving you and try and see if any of these things work. Like for example, there is something just called color. And what is the difference between uniform color and color? I don't know. Let's plug it. Let's see what happens. So the diffuse changed, supposedly, but here it didn't change. If I double click here, we can see different parameters on the right. And I realized that the color node here has certain inputs, which uniform color doesn't have. Inputs are these nodes on the left side, and outputs are the one on the right. So I can see that uniform color is basically just giving me an option for an input for a color, and that's it. I cannot modify it before. Whereas this one has a foreground, a background, and a mask. I'm just checking the random, the first thing that happened when I typed color.
How do you change the layout of that? Because I do not have a search bar, I just have a drop down menu.
Yeah. Is it control?
I am pressing space for the search bar, but you can also press tab. If you press tab, the same thing should happen. So this is the search bar. We do this in Blender by pressing Shift A and then search. Searching is definitely going to be important. So this should be pretty automated. The thing with Blender is that whenever we press Shift A, we can see all of them piled into the different categories. And when we go to search, we are just going to be recommended depending on the things that we write. I think the same here. When we press space and we go to, for example, I want to mix two things. I'll see if there is a mixer, channel mixer. This could be interesting for mixing two things, but like the operations that how are we going to utilize nodes together is going to change depending on the program. And for example, Blender has something called Mix Shader and Mix RGB, which is very obvious. Mix RGB takes two RGB values and mix them together. Here, for example, they use something called blend. So it's not the mixer, it's the blend that works like that in here. But that's fine. We are not going to care right now about all of these small differences between the programs. We're just going to create a very basic shader in the three programs. And we're going to go through the creation of this shader. Is it okay?
Yeah, she knows where to go. I don't know where she's going now, but
She can go through that door.
yeah, she know. Well, I tried to tell her, but she says she knew, but
She decided to not come.
I think she's going to get a cup of coffee, maybe.
No. She made the run. Sure.
How did you add the diffuse?
Where?
Well, if you scroll down a bit, you have a node that says diffuse.
Yeah, this is because I'm working with a standard shader. And this has to do with the type of preset you started with. If you started with a different preset, like PBR, metallic roughness, then you will have this base color.
Okay, I think I just started a new plane graph.
Yeah. Okay. If you start a new plane graph, I think you should be able to add these master nodes.
Well, nothing turns up.
That's true. Frame the no pin above. I'm sure that there is a way for creating outputs, but in general you will just work with one other template, a template that actually has the outputs.
Right.
How do you remove connecting points?
So you can select.
Can I select?
Yes, you can select the connection. Usually, this is something that you should be able to do. Select the node, select the output, or select the link between nodes.
Yeah.
And this is going to do different things.
Okay, yes, I think we make it business.
Okay. So let's open Blender. Let's open Substance. And let's not open everything at the same time. Let's go one by one, okay? And we are going to visit one of our dear friends we are going to try and make a basic shader that we see everywhere in games, and we're going to try and make it in all of these different programs. And this thing is called Fresnel shader. Does this sound familiar?
Yes.
A bit.
Yeah. It not necessarily should sound familiar, but you will.
Is it a light shader?
It's a. Okay, I'm going to draw it, and then we can see what it is. So I have an object like this. Actually, let me just do it on a different layer so that I can block the channel. I have an object, which is a sphere. And now I'm going to, with a soft brush, I'm going to draw light accumulating on the edges of this object. This is something that happens all the time. Whenever we get close to the edge of an object and we are seeing it, it turns lighter and lighter, or it accumulates more light. This effect is called Fresnel, and it's something that we utilize in games for lots of stuff. Actually, if this was sitting on a table or something, or on a chair or on a surface, the bottom part wouldn't be lit because there wouldn't be light accumulating there, but whatever. I'm going to increase the hardness here, and I'm going to just work this out a little bit.
If it was a cube, would it just be, the standard cube, right? On Blender where like the top is lit, the side facing us is dimly lit, and the side facing away from the light is just not lit at all.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point.
Because that's a sphere, it's more gradual or what?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. In general, Fresnel is going to utilize the where different faces are looking at and when different faces are looking away from the camera. So a cube that has 6 faces is just not going to give us a lot. And because it's so stepped, it's so differentiated, we are not going to get edge, we're not going to get light at the edge unless we have, we can try and check what would happen with a cube, and we're going to see it, because once we create the shader, we will be able to apply it wherever. But this thing happens in nature almost anywhere. Like If you check this bottle, probably you have some reflections stacking on the sides of the bottle that are not on the front of the bottle. Same with, for example, your hand. If you hold it in front of you, you can see how the parts that are in front do not stack as much light as the parts that are on the edge, because they just get light from more different sources. I'm just gonna look for Fresnel so that you get an idea of what I'm talking about. The most obvious example happens with water, Fresnel water surface. And yeah, you can see here what happens. Water turns virtually into a mirror the further away the surface is looking from us. So the more perpendicular our side is through the water, the more we see it as transparent, but the less perpendicular we see it, the more it turns into a reflective surface. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So on the bottom of the pond, we can clearly see the start. At the edge of the pond, we cannot see what's inside. That's Fresnel. Now let's make it. Any question with this?
No, that was it.
Okay,
Very good.
very good. So if we go to Blender, we have here our nice little subsurface scattered monkey. You could have anything. We're just going to utilize the Fresnel with our principled shader. So you don't need a monkey, you don't need a cube, you don't need anything in particular. You can just have any object and a principled shader with it. And we're gonna look for Fresnel, which happens to be a node. Easy. And something useful whenever we are working with shaders is visualizing what this node does. And this is something that we can do in Blender by pressing Ctrl, Shift, and clicking on the node. But this is something that only works if you have activated the Node Wrangler. And the Node Wrangler comes with Blender. I don't know why it's not activated by default. You can go into Edit and Preferences. And here in Add-ons, you can look for Wrangler. So basically, it's a tool for the node editor that lets you visualize the things. So activate the Node Wrangler. It's in Blender Preferences under Add-ons. Do you find it?
Which one was it?
Edit, Preferences. And from Preferences, we go to Add-ons, and we write Wrangler. Once we activate it, we should be able to click on any node that we have with Shift and Control, and it creates this small node that is a viewer node for us, and it automatically connects it to the material output. And suddenly our material changes, and we can see what the Fresnel is doing, which is very nice. We can see what Fresnel is in here. And actually, if we were having questions about how would this look on a cube, I can just where the cube went. Go to the world origin, selection to cursor. I'm going to move it next to the thing, and I'm just going to copy the material. So yeah, it's kind of boring in the cube. Like you don't really get a lot of it. If you get very close to the cube, though, you can start seeing it. But if you get away from the cube, it's like regular smoothness, or at least it looks like that. Anyways, forget about the cube. Let's go back to the monkey. On the monkey, we have a lot of curved surfaces, so we have a lot of Fresnel going on. And now we're going to utilize this in order to affect our principled shader. So what we have is this. We have a basic color. And now we are going to mix this value with the value of the Fresnel. And I was talking before about these mix nodes that we have in order to mix two outputs. And so let's try and bring from the search bar a mix RGB. Mix RGB looks like this. And if we try and connect our two outputs here, we're gonna get some red lines. And actually, if we try and connect it to the surface, we get a terrible purple. This happens because we are mixing two very different things. You see that the output here is green and the output here is gray. This can be translated easily into a color. We just saw it. But this is a shader on its own. So in order to mix shaders, we have a mixer called mix shader that is going to have these two dots that are for mixing two shaders. So we can start realizing that maybe our Fresnel cannot be mixed with our principal shader. What could we possibly do? So if we have, for example, a mix RGB that we know works with RGB values, do we have any input in here that is an RGB value? Base color. Yeah. So that's okay. We could bring an RGB that is utilizing the same color as we had before and do basically that, right? That would be basically just separating the color from our principal shader. So we could bring our Fresnel back here and utilize our mix before the shader output. And this should be okay. This should be fine. Wait, we could directly feed the color into the material output, or we could bring the color back into the principal shader and then utilize that. So the color data of our Fresnel is going to be mixed with our RGB. Now, this looks pretty much like it was looking before. And in our mix node, we can see here that we have a slider that is letting us see the Fresnel utilized as base color and the RGB that we established utilized as base color. And then we are mixing through those two like a linear interpolation. We just have 50% of this, 50% of that. That's what the mix node does. But then we have a blending mode, which is the probably interesting part. And this should remind you of Photoshop, because what we have here is basically blending modes for RGB values. We have darken, we have multiply, we have color burn, we have lighten, screen, color, dodge. And we can play around with this and see if we can get, like for example, I utilized color dodge and now suddenly I have some of the Fresnel appearing. And I can exaggerate it more by putting the factor to 1. And I think I could just keep looking around for different possibilities here until I find something that could be interesting. But I guess we can all agree that the Fresnel made as an input into the color is not looking very impressive. So whenever we want to ignore completely, light or shadow or in general any other interaction, we usually utilize unlit shaders or things that do not interact with light. And this is why we have emissive shaders or unlit shaders. emissive ones supposedly emit light, and lit shaders just do not interact with light. So if you want to create an overlay on an object with a color, and a lit shader or an emissive shader will be good for this, because no matter where the object is going to get this effect. And this is very useful, for example, for creating visual cues in a game. Like, this object can be picked, or this object is interesting, this object is interactable, this character is here. Like, sometimes if characters were not having a certain outline, you couldn't see them properly in games. So what we're going to try and do now is utilize our Fresnel not in the base color, but as an emission. Okay? And in order to do that, we're basically just going to take our... Okay, I'm going to separate this thing, and I'm going to cut through. I'm cutting through, pressing Control and right click. And this is how you disconnect nodes. It's kind of satisfying. So I go back to the previous setup. I no longer need this screen, I no longer need this thing. I only need my Fresnel. And what I'm going to try and do is connect my Fresnel into the emission input that we have here. And look at that. Right now I have the Fresnel appearing on top of everything as an emissive layer. So this thing doesn't interact with shadows, doesn't interact with light at all. So as an overlay, it works way better. But maybe we don't want the Fresnel to be white. Maybe we want the Fresnel to be a particular color. So let's just do one thing. By the way, with the emission strength, we can just tweak how the Fresnel intensity works. And with the IOR here in the Fresnel, we haven't touched this before, we can choose how the Fresnel, like the Fresnel intensity, the contrast of the Fresnel, from something that looks more natural, like the physically based Fresnel thing that gives us the typical value of 1.45, we can just go to something way more stylized, like 0.95, that is giving us this kind of insane outline effect. Okay?
How do you get the emission?
I connect.
Yeah, emission strength is just under the emission
I don't
input.
have a choice. Anymore.
You have it?
I don't have it on my.
You have a principled shader.
Yeah. But it's not below the emission. There's nothing there. Only the alpha.
Okay. Funny. This must be something that has to do with your Blender,
Probably.
version.
Probably.
Mm.
Okay, that's just the
Look, that's completely fine. There is a shader here. There is a shader called emission that you can bring that contains color and strength, and you can feed that with your Fresnel and utilize it in your emission. No, you cannot do that. Forget about that. Remember the thing that we were talking about with the mix shader? This is the type of thing you could do with a mix shader. Mix an emission shader with your principled shader, and it looks purple again. I think it's just because you need to do that thing. So this could actually work for you, right? Instead of utilizing the emission that the principled shader comes with, you utilize an emission shader that actually comes with the strength. You feed the Fresnel there, and then you utilize a mix shader for mixing those two. So you can get to the same result in very different ways. In general, this is always going to happen. And we will see this happens in Blender, in Unity, and in Substance. So it's not really important how we get there. It's a matter of knowing what we want and trying to find a way. Of course, there is more practical ways of finding stuff. But by no means there is one solution to this problem. So the last thing I want to do to finalize my emission Fresnel shader is I want to be able to choose the color to signify if this is something good, is if it's bad, if it's pickable, or if it's whatever, if it's receiving damage, for example. So we somehow want the Fresnel, which already has a color, we saw it when we were visualizing it, we want the Fresnel to be mixed with a color. How can we possibly do that? Let's utilize the nodes that we had from before. We had a mix RGB and we had an RGB value. And we're going to mix the Fresnel. And in here, I'm just going to do a mix. I'm going to utilize the basic one. And I'm going to choose in my RGB value red. So let's see what this does. I have my Fresnel that is already working with an emission and connected into the material output. And now I'm going to mix it with a red RGB value and utilize that as a color. Not really working, I see. So in the basic setup where you receive a mix, you realize that the Fresnel that operates only in the white sides of the object is getting mixed with an RGB value that by default is operating on the whole object. So this is why we're getting the mixture of the two. So the RGB value works on the whole object, and the Fresnel only works on the Fresnel effect. And this has to do with the factor of how we are mixing this thing. The factor right now is just mixing 50% of Fresnel and 50% of the color value. And that's why when we have them together, we have a little bit of both. The interesting thing is that our Fresnel has an output that says factor. And if we feed that factor into the factor of the mix, boom. We have an interesting thing going on. So now we're utilizing the Fresnel not only for giving the color, but also for doing the mix between the two colors. Does this make sense? Let's look at this mix RGB. We are basically mixing two inputs with a certain factor, and then we have a blending mode. The blending mode right now is just mix. The factor is 0.5, which means that we have 50% RGB, 50% Fresnel, which is not what we want because the entire monkey is glowing. We don't want the entire monkey to glow. We only want the Fresnel to mix. We only want the Fresnel side to be glowing. What else? So Fresnel is giving us the information for where do we want the emission. We are not even caring about the Fresnel color. We just want the emission to be the color of our choosing and utilize the Fresnel to place this emission, right? I don't know if you're getting ideas, but I am getting ideas. Because maybe we don't want to mix the two colors. Maybe we just want one color. And what we want of the Fresnel is just the mixture, the factor of how we are mixing our two shaders. Does this make sense? I will illustrate what I'm thinking about. Our mix shader has a factor, and right now it's just a mixture between the two. If we could tell our mix shader, hey, I want a regular material for the object, and on the Fresnel side I want an emissive material, then we would have a perfect blend between the two. We would utilize the Fresnel only for emission and the not Fresnel only for the regular material. Let's see if this could work. We are no longer going to utilize the Fresnel for color. We're just going to utilize it as the factor of mixing. I'm going to take this out. Now our Fresnel is only our factor of mixing between an emission shader and a regular shader. This right now is not really useful. We don't want a mix anymore. We just want a color. And look at that. We can control the strength. And with our Fresnel, we can control how big our factor is. And if you see, we are basically mixing. I'm going to bring this in here so that we can do our tests. We are mixing an emission shader and we are mixing a principal shader utilizing the Fresnel as a factor. All of this is kind of blending layers in Photoshop. We're just creating a mask with our Fresnel that is letting the emission shader show on our basic material. That's what we're doing. End result, this. I don't like it very much, but okay, this is okay. Good thing is that we can just change the color as whatever we want. So if the monkey is being healed, we can put it in green, and if it's been damaged, we can put it in red, and if it's been frozen, we can put it in blue. Useful stuff. Okay, questions about this? This is a very basic shader that we have everywhere and that everyone is utilizing for all kinds of stuff.
So how would you differentiate between those values in, say, Unity, like in-game?
Mm-hmm.
How would you translate the slider to in-game mechanic?
Okay, so what happens in Unity is that we're creating a shader that eventually values of this shader go on the inspector, right? Then you can create a C# script that is going to toggle on and off, move around values of this inspector, right? What we are not having in Blender is an inspector here that we can utilize this, but Blender is not a game engine. The beautiful thing of Blender is that we are on an animation and rendering program, which means that we can go on any of these values and actually just add a keyframe. And we move around in time, we change this value, and we add another keyframe. And then it's animated. Like, that's something that you can also do in Unity, but this is the easy thing in Blender, like adding keyframes to everything or animating everything. But yeah, you could easily control these things in-game. You could make them respond to an input. You could make them respond to a change of values. Okay? Good? Shall we move on to the next program?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to try and utilize the same ideas we utilized in here in Substance Painter. Thing is, Substance Painter might have completely different setup for this, but the idea is the same. We are mixing two shaders, utilizing a Fresnel as a factor for mixing an emission and a base color, right?
A designer?
Yeah, designer.
Okay. Use the thing.
Sorry. We'll go on designer. And here I have a basic PBR metallic roughness. Is the metallic roughness going to give us some input for emission? No. No, it doesn't. So maybe we will have to check if we have any emission in any of these. Damn it. Where's the emission? Huh. Emissive. Okay. So in the Alchemist filter, it seems that we have an output for emissive. And then we have diffuse, base color, specular, normal. We have basic stuff. Let's try and get that one. Oh, damn it.
Oh,
That's a lot. So I'm going to try and bring a cube. It's completely broken. Oh, okay. Maybe this needs to be working with Alchemist. Maybe this is not something we can do in here. It probably has to, because even if I select the color, like I can see the texture, but I cannot see the object. I'm trying to look for a sphere. No. No. Okay. So I'm gonna go back, and I'm just gonna choose a boring PBR shader. Could we maybe add here stuff? No. Okay. So we will work with what we have. It's okay. We have some ambient occlusion, height, metallic, roughness, normal, and base color. I guess that what we will do here is we will input it into the base color. Strange that they don't give us the option for adding the emissive, but maybe we could add the emissive later as an extra output. Like, no. I will check that. I will check that later. By the way, what time is it? It's 11. We have 1 hour. No, it's okay. Let's continue. We are not tired yet. Yeah.
I don't have any like PBR.
Okay. So when you go into new substance, you don't have these.
No.
What do you have?
It's,
Yeah.
It's just because you're on the Adobe substance and not just substance. It's just called metallic roughness or metallic whatever.
Okay. If you have metallic roughness, just go to metallic roughness. So let's try and start bringing stuff that we were utilizing in Blender. Probably the most obvious is going to be the Fresnel, and there is no Fresnel. So we are gone. Damn it, Substance. I hoped that Substance would have something for Fresnel, but it doesn't. That's terrible. Okay. If Substance doesn't have anything for Fresnel, we could try and look for. Because what a Fresnel basically does is it measures camera rays and chooses the ones that are perpendicular as 0, and as it moves away from perpendicularity, it just moves them to 1. That's what it does. So we could try and create a artificial Fresnel by utilizing camera input, but I'm not sure if that's going to be as easy. So just as a security measure, I would start opening Unity, because Shader Graph definitely lets us work with Fresnel. Okay, so start opening Unity, and I'm just going to check here if we can utilize some camera information.
There's in the forum, there's a guy that says Substance Designer generates textures and the Fresnel effect is view dependent.
Is?
View dependent.
Yeah.
And that makes it impossible in Substance Designer.
I get this. Substance Designer is an amazing program for creating procedural textures, but you see that whatever thing we do here, we are getting as an output a texture.
Yeah.
And this is like that because at the end of the workflow with Substance Designer, what we do is export textures. Export textures that we're going to be able to then afterwards utilize in Substance Painter or something like that. But this is not something you can animate, for example. This is not something you can move around. You don't utilize time here, for example. So when we are comparing with Blender and with Shader Graph, for example, Substance Designer is a little bit behind on the flexibility, but it's way beyond in the amount of things it can do with textures. So for example, Substance Designer has a very complicated blur possibility that you don't have in Blender, you don't have in Unity, because blur is super expensive. But because Substance Designer doesn't need to work real time, or it doesn't need to work with animated objects or whatever, because the ultimate object of Substance Painter is getting textures, it can afford to do all of this super complicated stuff. Another thing Substance Designer has is a warp node that warps things with noise amazingly. We will go back to Substance Designer, and we will do a shader also with Substance Designer at the end. We will maybe not do a Fresnel one, which maybe it's very real time and very complicated or not relevant for Substance Designer. Sorry that I chose this one in particular, but maybe we can utilize Substance Designer to talk about something that we're going to be talking about a lot. You remember noise?
Yes.
Our friend noise? Well, Substance is very good at noise. And if we go here and just go on the Finder and type noise, just check the sheer amount of options that we are getting. And I mean, if you go on Blender and you type noise in the search, we get 2.
Oh.
How did you get the search bar up in design? Like when you
Space or tab.
Thank you.
Yes, space or tab is for the search bar. So you can start realizing the amount of stuff Substance Designer has and how deep it can go when you type noise. And here we have from Perlin Noise, which is our very good friend that in the 80s, and while Tron was being made, developed this noise that now is utilized everywhere, to Whirly Noise, anisotropic noise, cell noise, which is Voronoi, if you know Voronoi. It's this type of noise that creates crackles, that creates things like fractures. And you not only have 2D noise, I'm sure that you also have 3D noise, and you have dirt, whatever that thing is. Like, okay, it's procedural dirt. So these are noise upon noise. These are already made noise packages that come very useful, very handy, because look at the resolution of this thing. And actually, we can just keep upscaling it, right? Right? Yes, we can. Of course, we are limited by the resolution that we have eventually of our texture, but Blender doesn't have this. ShaderGraph doesn't have this. We are creating procedural textures on the go and baking them in here in Substance Designer. Very nice, very cool. We can utilize this as our color. Oh, and now we have it here. And not only that, we can also utilize it as our roughness. Funny.
Well, that's weird.
That's interesting, huh? So it's utilizing the black values for complete roughness, which is complete reflectivity, and utilizing the white values for the other thing. Maybe we could actually add an invert color or invert grayscale. What?
I think he does not have.
Oh.
The more lost if you.
Is it what?
Yeah, so basically we utilize this dirt in order to utilize it for the base color, and then we inverted grayscale to utilize it as our roughness. So now it's the white spots that are shiny. Like if we could check these, this would make a very nice ash ground, because it would create some specularity, some small shines that would be nice. We cannot really see it, but you can maybe imagine it. How this works. What were you saying, Ash? Okay, that was your question.
But we could also make the white thing brown and now it's dirt.
Exactly. So we could do a blend with color. By the way, how does color work? Does it work with RGB? No, it doesn't work with RGB. It probably works with uniform color. Uniform color. Do we have non-uniform direction warp color? Non-uniform warp color. that there's so many options here. Like, it's so easy to play here with random stuff. But for example, let's just bring some random uniform color. Okay. Thank you. And I will just choose.
That's good word.
And now I'll blend this with this.
I think you put it in.
Yeah. Opa. So this is opacity, background, and foreground. Okay, so this thing could go in here. This thing can go in here. No, it cannot.
Now it's angry.
Opacity should be 1, and so but blend maybe is not blend. Maybe color, foreground, background.
There's a mask.
Yeah, there is a mask, but the mask could work. But check, the background color is just, oh, maybe this should be the background color. And the foreground could be another one that is darker, like this. Oh, I'm changing that one. Okay, whatever.
How do we get the triple connection point at the left side?
That's the one that's just called color.
Uniform color.
Oh, dang. Color?
So this is this.
Oh, there we go.
No, this is the roughness. This is the roughness. The roughness is actually giving us something, but we are not actually able to mask our foreground and background with the noise, which is very weird because this seems pretty straightforward what we're doing here. We have a background, we have a foreground, and we have a, let's try color equalizer, color match, uniform color, input color, blah, 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 blah. No. Let's see. So we have a gradient, and our gradient is, I'm just bringing the gradient because I know that gradients sometimes are weirdly the solution to problems. So I'm gonna choose some dirt possibilities here. Like I'm gonna go here, choose this, and I'm gonna finally go here. This could be some dirt gradient. So we have a gradient, and now I'm going to input the noise as an input for the gradient. Okay, that's doing it. So we go on our gradient, and now we go here and turn this thing. Oh no, not that one. This one. Am I selecting this one? Can I delete this? Am I selecting this one? Exactly. Okay, so yeah, it's a matter of, weirdly, it's a matter of trying stuff, but hopefully it's relatively possible to find whatever thing you're using. So with a gradient you can. Yes, Alison.
So I actually had a question, which is an unfortunate timing. What if does this program have stuff like surface imperfections, like fingerprints and stuff like that?
And it has procedural ones.
Right.
So it already has packaged noise-based or procedural-based scratches, imperfections. Like, look, when we were looking at noise, here you have, for example, dirt, which is, I think, the one we are utilizing here. Then we have fluid, fractal sun base, fur, and we also have grunge. So all of these things are procedurally generated masks or effects that we can utilize, and that we would have to create ourselves, for example, in Blender, using several noise-based things that would eventually just create a very complicated network. But here, it's as easy as just choosing your thing, and here you have the parameters for moving it. Disorder, you have parameter for disorder. Amazing. Very cool. Disorder, yeah.
Does this program have
But I think if you wanted to do something so specific like a fingerprint, it would probably be in Substance Painter.
Yeah, but I've just seen like people make like amazing 3D models and then they give them surface things
Like
and
if you're
then.
thinking like the Lego movie, then like
Well, also that actually that's a good example.
then
But
that's probably Substance Painter.
but I follow someone that makes like Gundams, but it's like for
So if you go to
stuff,
scene,
she put like fingerprints.
here you can select on the top
You do that in Painter,
cube,
like
cylinder,
a
whatever.
fingerprint, like Photoshop or something, and you do that as like like a grime stain.
Ashkan,
Yeah.
check this. Grunge maps. And these are very, very good. And you can utilize this. Like, with this, you could easily do fingerprints. And it has, like, how many grunge stuff? A lot. And I have the feeling that, I mean, if this was truly procedural, it would give us a random seed. It's probably utilizing modular pieces that then get multiplied everywhere. Like, I don't believe this is entirely procedural. I have the feeling that if we go here, we can see this small scratch here, and if we go here, we can probably find that scratch somewhere else. If it's truly procedural, I am amazed, but whatever.
Well, the fact that you're wondering if it is right now means that if it's not, it's good modular systems.
Yes, exactly.
We made a Minecraft look. It's dirt.
It's true, it's true, it's there. We could also downscale it so that it has this pixelated thing. Do we have Unity open?
Yes.
Okay, if we have Unity open, I say it because we will go back to Substance Designer. We will go back here. Substance Designer is like a procedural painting app.
Yeah.
Universal Render Pipeline or HDR Render Pipeline is what we're going to be using in Unity. And here, what we're going to do is, yet again, try our Fresnel shader. And this time, I'm very quickly just going to check if there is a Fresnel option.
There's inside in red.
There is Fresnel. Okay, so then I'm not going to say anything, and we're just all going to try and make the Fresnel shader ourselves, utilizing what we learned from Blender. Does that make sense?
You might need to show how to get shader graph.
So what we want to do is KDK workshops, procedural workshop. What we want to do is right click, create, and where it says shader, we're going to get an option for our universal render pipeline. This is a long way. It should be easier, but okay. Once you've gone to create, shader, and universal render pipeline, you can create a lit shader graph.
How did you get to create?
I just right click here on the top.
Down there, okay. Great.
Shader, universal render pipeline, and lit shader. And this is going to create one object with this icon, which is going to be a shader graph object. We can call this Fresnel shader. And when we create it, we have it here, and we can actually just check Open Shader Editor in the inspector. Yep. Which unit version are you using? That's going to give you the same option. And the type of shader we want to reproduce is a shader that utilizes Fresnel as emission, and we can control the color of the Fresnel. and then it has a regular surface color. So we could say it has a skin with a color, and then it has an emission based on a Fresnel. So that's the thing we want to create. Is this thing still recording? Yeah, it didn't break.
In Unity, was it the, what was after the universal rented pipeline?
Lit
Where?
graph.
Okay, cool.
Yes. Lit shader graph.
Sorry. Ja. Altså, du kan, hvis du klikker på sådan en i shift space, så maksimerer du den ud. Meget. Det er,
Why is it so big?
det er bare sådan en mærkelig data analyse ting. Altså du kan sige her, vi valgte, at det skulle være det, men du kan godt nå, at det ikke er det, eller at det skal være, eller overfor, okay. Det er sådan helt generelt. Ja, det her så fragment er noget, det er basically det her med venstre nærmere. Det er det, vi har for, altså det er vertex, det er symbol for shader til ændre på vores geometri. Så vi kan prøve at møde position, så du får til at ændre på positionen af den vertexes i model. Det er samtidig også heroppe på normen af den. Så det er ikke kun en bare sådan, det er sådan ting, som har noget med at gøre. Jeg ved ikke, hvad ting gør. Som også lægger med næsten, de ting er der. Men ting til over vores overflade der. Så det er der.
Somehow this thing is not working with the preview. But maybe in yours it will.
Mine is fine.
Yours is fine? Okay, cool. Because I'm saying saving asset, but it's not doing anything. Okay. I'll show you how did I find it, and actually it's easier than in Blender. You can tell me if you did something different. I brought my Fresnel. I established some values for the power that I wanted here, and I brought a color. I multiplied those values because if we try and add them, for example, then the black of the Fresnel would disappear. So in order to utilize only the white parts of the Fresnel, what I did was multiply it with the color. And then I utilized that input into the emission. And then I have a regular color for the base color. That's what I did. Anyone else solved it in a different way?
I don't know if it works.
I can't choose the color.
Sorry?
I can't really change the color.
You can change the color of what?
I can't change the color of my basic color.
Ooh.
What were you saying?
I don't know if it works, but I took the Fresnel effect and another color than the base color, in this case red, and then I fed the two into a blend, and then I took the output from the blend and plugged it into emission.
Good. Yeah. Okay, let me check if this thing is a value of Unity or what. And we can now create a material with it in order to see if it works or not.
Okay.
No. How do you?
It's just not letting me right?
Oh.
Last year.
And 2019.4, and it's 2020.3.
Try and go the long-term release 2020 and see if that works for you. It'll take a bit of time, but we are anyways going to finish soon, so it's not a problem. We're not going to do anything crazy until now. Just try and download that Unity version and see.
I guess I need to leave in 10 minutes.
Forever? Or are you going to come
I'm gonna
after?
come back about 1:30, something like that.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. We have class until 3.
Great. I'll be back between 1 and half past.
Last thing so that we can visualize, please just a second. When we have our shader done or doing something and we say save asset, our object here, our shader graph item, our shader graph file, gets updated with the things that we did. And now in order to create a material that is referencing this shader graph, what we can do is create a material by right-clicking on our shader graph, the one that we created. So if we right-click on our Fresnel shader and we go to create material, the thing that pops up is a material that is already referencing our shader graph's Fresnel shader, and it's here. And we can actually go into the scene and drag and drop it and check how it's working. And look, it works. It does the thing. One last thing. The values that we have here in our shader graph are not exposed in the inspector. And this is something that we can do utilizing this tab here. This tab here, which is the blackboard. If you don't see the blackboard, you can just click here and it will appear. Blackboard. Maybe you're not seeing it because you're here.
I couldn't see the mouse that was working.
Okay. So the blackboard is basically this panel that is empty and it has a plus. And when you see the plus, it gives you all of the possible variables you can expose in the inspector, which is basically an idea of what are the things you might want to use in order to control these values. For example, I want to control my Fresnel power, which is one value. So I can do a vector 1 or a float. And this is going to be called power. And whenever we create a variable, it creates this small node that is going to have some attributes, and we can drag and drop here. It's basically the same as setting a value here. We are basically just, I will bring also the graph inspector so that you see what's happening. If I create a value, I drag and drop it here, and I put it as my power output. It's right now going to show probably 0 because the default value is 0. This is the graph inspector. But if I move it around, you will see that it's doing exactly the same thing that the other thing was doing. The only difference being this is exposed in the inspector. So if I save my asset and I go back to my scene, here now I have a power value that I can move around. Hey! We can do this with colors, we can do this with vectors, we can do this with sliders, we can do it with a lot of stuff.
How did you save it as a shader?
So when we are on our shader view and we make a change, let's, for example, create a color variable, call it color.
No, just save it as like a, no, not a shader, save it as a material.
How did I create a material reference in the shader?
Yes.
So there's two ways. One is you select your shader, right click on it,
Yes.
and create a material from it. So you go into create material. By right clicking on your shader, it's going to be referenced in the shader. You could as well just create a regular material, which is going to give you a plain universal render pipeline material. And then on the shader here on top of the inspector, you can look for your shader graphs and say for null shader. It's basically the same thing. Anyways, I create a color, and this color is going to be the thing that is going to be multiplied with the Fresnel instead of this. Now I save that, go to my scene, and check that out. I have a color. Now I can move it. Boom. Beautiful. What other things could be useful? We could control the main color of the material, so we could create another color variable for that, which we could call main color. And we could actually create a multiplier for the emission so that we can choose how emissive is the material. So we could actually bring another multiply here and create a float that is going to be the emission power. And if we can plug this into the multiplier, we could actually create more or less power for the emission. We plug that into the emission, we save the shader, and here, now we could make it more or less powerful. I think that because we are not having a post-processing activated, we cannot see how powerful it's actually, but it would affect the bloom a lot. So I think the only thing I need to do is just go into the, should I activate the main camera, say post-processing? No, it doesn't care. How did you activate post-processing? Lighting? No. Shaded. post-processing is active here. Effects.
It's volume.
Yes. Good.
Volume.
Global volume that I'm gonna pause effects, and I'm just gonna create a profile, or I probably have an FX profile already that has just chromatic aberration. That's not useful.
No, you can just use it.
Okay, look here, I have good. So if I go now to my objects and I go to my shader and I say power more, oh no, that's not the power I want, it's this power I want. Now it glows more. Nice. Now we can chin. Woo. So once you have your material in the inspector, it should show the different values you created on your shader, the ones you created here on the blackboard. So for each of these, you're going to have a default value and an exposed or non-exposed check. If you set them as exposed, you should see them in the inspector. Just remember to always save your asset before checking the scene view, because if you don't save, the values are not going to be there. So here on your object, you should have all the values you created on your blackboard, and you should be able to manipulate them, and it should affect stuff.
How do you make the shader graphs that you need to add so you can have them on the extension side? How do I make that color?
So on our shader,
I have added it, but I'm not sure if it was I created. Oh, yeah, that was one called color. No,
okay.
I found it.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.